the rain. This is my first time using this mic, and it's my first time experiencing what it's like to be Britney Spears or J-Lo with this mic here. Lifelong dreams happening today at the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum. But in all seriousness, thank you so much, sincerely, for joining us today. We are so grateful for your support. I have many, many thanks to give today, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues for giving me 2 opportunities for thanks. So I'll say some words today about the exhibition, but also later at 4:30 we have remarks, and there are tours throughout today's program if you're looking for more content about the exhibitions. First and foremost, I want to thank Narcís and Ramón Cernura, whose knowledge of Cuban art remains unparalleled in our community. And I thank you so much for your support for this exhibition and its companion catalog. I would also like to thank Cookie and Ralph Gazatua. Cookie is a longtime board member of the Frost Art Museum, and thank you so much for your constant and consistent support of our museum. Thank you to the Jorge and Darlene Perez Endowment. This funding supports the collection of Cuban art and its related programming kindly given by the Perez family. These were among the first works that sparked my interest when I joined the Frost Art Museum 4.5 years ago. It is an honor to have access to these works and to present some of them in our current exhibition. Today, we're celebrating many new exhibitions, which again, I'll have an opportunity to acknowledge them later. One of those shows, though, is New Acquisitions Collections Highlights, and I'm so thrilled that Yanira Collado is here today, and we're debuting a recent acquisition in our galleries of her work. I've always liked working in a museum because of the collaboration. I thought, will I be a professor or will I be a curator? And for me, being a curator is inherently about collaboration. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues at the museum, especially Yadi Rivero, Lourdes Renero, Jean Carlos Fernandez, who were key partners over the last 2.5 years as we put this exhibition in the mind's eye, Landscapes of Cuba, together. I see that Professor Jorge Duani is here today. He is the director of the Cuban Research Institute. I remember going to his office a couple of years ago and saying, I have 3 ideas of projects related to Cuban art, and he pushed me in this direction, and I'm grateful for that. Also, I see my colleague Donette Francis. The catalog for In the Mind's Eye, Landscapes of Cuba marks our 3rd collaboration together, and I thank you for bringing your expertise to this project. As Professor Duani and Donette Francis are professors, they know the power of mentorship. And I would like to take a few moments to thank one of the most significant mentors in my life, Elizabeth Kennedy, who's traveled today to join us from Pittsburgh. Several years ago, she said to me, you really need to look into those US artists who were in Cuba at the turn of the century. And I had known about Winslow Homer and his time in the Caribbean, but I quickly learned that was only the surface. And so my research for this project began. Thank you so much, Betsy, for your constant support. And this show is a tribute to your mentorship. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome these wonderful people that are sitting over here. Juana Valdés, Lilian Garcia-Roig, and Emilio Perez. All 3 artists are featured in our exhibition that opens today, In the Mind's Eye, Landscapes of Cuba. I see some people standing in the back. If you're feeling brave, we've got seats in the front row. So
Feels like
on
I'm
the side, come on down. But I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Juana Valdés uses printmaking, photography, sculpture, ceramics, and site-specific installations to explore issues of race, transnationalism, gender, labor, and class. Functioning as an archive, Valdés' work analyzes and decodes experiences of migration as a person of Afro-Caribbean heritage. Recent solo exhibitions include Terrestrial Bodies at the Miami-Dade College Freedom Tower and Rest Ashore at Locus Projects. Juana's work has been included in group exhibitions at museums and universities such as the Perez Art Museum, Museo del Barrio, MoMA PS1, and the Mason Gross Galleries at Rutgers University. Awarded by the Mellon Foundation and the Ford Foundation, Juana Valdés is a 2022 recipient of the Latinx Artist Fellowship. Born in Pinar del Rio, Cuba, Valdés came to the United States in 1971 and received a BFA in sculpture from the Parsons School of Design and her MFA from the School of Visual Arts. And she is an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And I'm so grateful that she came to Miami from Massachusetts. Thank you, Juana.
Thank you.
Born in Havana, Cuba, Lilian Garcia-Roig was raised in Texas and presently lives in Tallahassee. Lilian Garcia-Roig's landscapes examine ideas of place, belonging, identity, and perceptual experience. Garcia-Roig has exhibited at the Americas Society Gallery in New York, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and the Art Museum of the Americas, both in Washington, D.C. Her work was included in Relational Undercurrents, Contemporary Art of the Caribbean Archipelago, which opened in 2017 at the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, and we were very proud to exhibit that exhibition here at the Frost Art Museum in 2019. Lilian was recently included in the Florida Prize in Contemporary Art exhibition at the Orlando Museum of Art, as well as the Florida Contemporary at the Baker Museum in Naples. She received an MFA from the University of Pennsylvania and a BFA from Southern Methodist University. She is a professor at Florida State University, where she currently chairs the Department of Art. So thank you also for taking time to come here. And my last introduction is for Emilio Perez. Inspired by his personal history, life experiences, and travels, Emilio Perez's paintings reveal an interest in the natural landscape and a lifelong passion for the sea. By layering memories and fleeting imagery, the artist evokes a visual experience that seduces the viewer via the dynamic forces of nature, together with a desire to understand how the narrative unfolds and where it is destined to go. Born in New York, Perez attended Pratt Institute and the University of Florida's New World School of the Arts. Perez's work can be found in the permanent collections of PAM Albright Knox in Buffalo, Fundación Arco, Madrid, and Arkansas Art Center, Little Rock. He's participated in Critical Gestures at PAM, the 12th Havana Biennial, and many other exhibitions. He's had solo shows at Gallery Lalonde in New York and Paris, and stay tuned, he'll soon have a solo show at Frederick Schnitzer's gallery here in Miami. So welcome, Emilio.
Thank you. Wow, that's like a full house.
So thank you for indulging me, and now we can move on to what you're all here for, is to hear from these three wonderful artists. Juana, I'd love to start with you, and can you tell us a little bit about this project? Probably many of us saw it. If you didn't, rest assured was Juana's exhibition at Locus Projects, and it led to our discussion about this exhibition, In the Mind's Eye.
And the selection for the work, which you see is one of the piece in the back. So Locus Project, actually the exhibition took place in 2020, right in the midst of the pandemic, but it began actually in 2018 with an Ulite Award. And that award was specifically to look at the Cuban migration right? And to stipulate images out of the media, and to work in video and installation, which is something that I had not had the opportunity to do before. And so this particular back section of the exhibition projects a video that actually was filmed. And actually, it's the experience of someone going on the journey of, not the journey of actually migrating, and what that experience would be like for being in the sea, and the troubles and the many jeopardy that the experience brings along with that. And for part of the exhibition, I also focus in the back on two videos, and the video is one, the idea of sort of that eternal possibility of hoping for something better to come, and then the other one, which is the video of sort of what does it takes to make this decision to migrate, right? And and sort of retrospective also look at what happens when you migrate, and the perpetual longing. The main part of the exhibition, which is what you're seeing here, is you're coming into an environment that actually looks like you were in a shipping yard, right? And you're being kind of trafficked. And so we have like over close to somewhere between 300 to 500 pallets that block the entrance to the space. And you walk into the space, and you're sort of the only way that you can see the video that shows you the experience of the journey by sea is by actually stepping on the pallets. And the moment you're on the pallet, you're a product. Your body becomes an object that can be shipped and can be moved about. And the whole idea was to us to question the idea of migration. And what spurred the video actually was looking at the images of uh, the great migration that was coming out of Africa and Syria in 2015, and upon the Mediterranean shore in Greece and in Italy. And the kind of horrific image that we're seeing, that as a Cuban, they're familiar. The story is very familiar, and you see the story repeating itself again and in another group, in another country.
Juana, if I remember correctly, you also did a lot of archival research in conjunction with this exhibition. Can you tell us a little bit? I believe it was the Wolfson Archives was one of the
Yes,
sources.
I was very lucky again to have access to the Wolfson Archives, and it chronicled actually 4 decades. It begins right in the beginning of 1960, 70, 80s, and all the way to the ending of the 90s. And I actually looked for imagery of the media from primarily some newspaper. I actually did the collection, also the Miami, at the University of Miami. I did the Miami History Museum collection, and I'm trying to think, and I actually also some excerpts from the Miami Herald. But so the video, which is the front of the exhibition, we don't have an image for here,
Oh.
looks at the media footage of actually the Cuban migration from the very beginning, and begins with early their first like camarioca and an image of that, and then goes into the freedom flights, and then into the Maria board lift. And so, but it's all not personal history, it's all media footage. So you're seeing Ferrer. There's a wonderful clip of Ferrer talking about what was happening, and the kind of language was being, the rhetoric that was coming out in the media about immigrants, and they're being criminals, and they're being sort of shifty, all the same repetition that we've been hearing within the late in the beginning of the 21st century. And so the video is projected in all TVs, and is sort of kind of walled in by two sides. By research from the Pew Foundation, and the research from the Pew Foundation actually chronicles all Latinos or Latinx in the United States. I specifically selected the information on Cuban, and so it chronicled like when do we marry, how many, who, like Cubans in Florida buy more property than Cubans anywhere else in the United States. Whether it's because you want to outdo your neighbor or not, it holds that kind of information. It also talks about the kind of degree, how much money we make. We're one of the highest income makers of all Latinos in the United States. Sort of kind of parenting that, or sort of mirroring that, is also an article with chronicling all the aids that Cubans have received since coming to the United States. So to draw a parallel that you can be as wonderful as we are, and maybe we are, and as exceptional as we are, and maybe we are. It also has been helped with incredible amount of funding legally through laws and also through funds early on. I think the amount is like close to $6 million, which right now would be quadruple that amount in value was given to Cubans when they first started to arrive in the United States. And the whole idea behind that was to make us think about migration, that is a component of the 21st century. And we will migrate for climate, we will migrate because of political, we will migrate for a lot of reasons. And at any particular time, it could happen to anybody, as we can see right now with Ukraine. Right? And so the work was really to make us think about that and to really question what the future of migration will be through the Cuban experience.
Great, great. I see I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty with the clicker, which it could be me. My colleagues would not be surprised if it was me. Oh, I think it is me. Okay, there we go. So this gives you an up-close look at the work in the exhibition, Eternal Sunset, which you saw in the back here of the project at Locus Projects. Juana, can you tell us a little bit about what you were thinking in terms of the notion of sunsets in creating this work?
For me, I think this is what encompasses sort of that Latinx experience, right? In terms that it really incorporates what it's like to be in America and sort of the growing up with Hollywood in films and that idea of happily ever after. Being something that once desired, the American dream, so kind of golden, road, all of that. And for me and for Hollywood, it has been used in the epitome of the sunset, right? You always have the hero, riding into the sunset, the car driving into the sunset. And so I wanted to use this imagery in a way to also talk about what is it like to be caught in this loop of something that you're perpetually aspiring to but never reach. And so you're seeing these beautiful sunsets that are beginning and they're about to end, but they never end and they continue. And you're in a perpetual loop of ever wanting to aspire to that place, the idea of safety and home and well-being, and it's just there, almost about to reach, but never quite as accessible as it could be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the aspects of the exhibition that you'll all see very soon, if you haven't seen already, is Juana's work is paired with artists who are very much inspired by Romanticism and the Barbizon School, Esteban Chartrand's light and color in the paintings that are sort of on either side of this work. And I wonder for Juana or for Lilian or Emilio, if you could talk a little bit about the use of light in your practices.
I have to say, for me with this work, it's 3 monitors, and it's a way of, like, I'm not a painter, so I will acknowledge that for those painters in the room. But I like conceptually working with the idea of painting, and for me, this gave me the opportunity to do that in video. So it's just the colors are just absolutely beautiful, and so you have the best of both worlds. You have the light and the luminosity of painting and the moving image together, and my tinkering with the idea of painting. For the real painters in the room.
Sure. Yeah.
Lilian, you paint so much outdoors. Do you want to talk a little bit about the role of light in your work?
So I do paint outside. I don't think so much about light as much as color and time and just grabbing as much visually as I experience. So it's not about a moment in time, like someone like Monet was very interested in that. I'm interested in the idea of a cumulative, I guess, experience of time. So, what does a place look like if you're looking at it the entire day? Right? It's not really about light anymore. It's about something else. So light is not quite what I think about, but light passes throughout the day, and so that's the kind of what I'm interested in, catching little nuggets.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that also that when it comes to light, it's true that light itself has a unique quality no matter where you are. So my painting process also is one that's quite intuitive, and I don't really think about light as much, but I do notice that the influence that comes from different places that I've been to, places that inspire my work, that light has its own personality. Like if you go to Maine, for example, Maine has a very specific kind of
Yeah.
light that you'd find in the summer. Same for any other place. So that's just an example of a place that really struck me the first time I went there. And of course, the Caribbean, has that quality too. And I think that we share a lot of that here in Florida too.
Yeah, definitely. Part of having Juana's work also sandwiched with these 19th century paintings and the exhibition writ large is interrogating history and interrogating depictions of 19th century landscapes. And Juana, I know something that you have done in your practice is mine histories of colonialism in the Caribbean and more globally. And I did include in our presentation today a bit of a flashback to a previous work that we were very proud to exhibit here at the Frost Art Museum in the exhibition I mentioned previously, Relational Undercurrents. Could you talk a little bit about the role of sort of interrogating historical tropes and ideas in your practice?
Right now I'm actually I have to begin how because this is such a long story, but I'll make it really quick. The beginning is my sort of kind of understanding in wanting to use ceramic and porcelain and specifically bone china. And so coming from the Caribbean, I sort of question the authenticity of that and why that particular desire. And of course, then I have to go into looking at history and why and how is it that we have porcelain. Like I remember being here in Miami and going into visiting other Cuban families that had also come from Cuba, and you would see like porcelain, you would see like lladro and all these other things, and I'm like, why are these people holding on to this rope that doesn't even represent them? And so that's when I sort of go back into history to look at it as how is it that this arrives at the Caribbean, and of course we can but not go into the aspect of colonization and the whole idea of empire building and how the discovery of the new world is embedded with the discovery of commerce and travel in a combination of extraction and exploitation of resources. And for me, I start to use sort of bone china and the purchasing of commodities for the home by women because I am sort of focused on the experience of women within the work. And I started to collect all of these bone chinas, which I document and use in this particular work, which is cyanotype. And the whole idea was to show how these objects also sort of kind of as a replacement for bodies are moving through water from one place to another as a part of commerce, but also part of migration, and also part of sort of talking back of the transatlantic slave and the movement of body from Africa to Europe and into the Americas and how that impacted and defines who we are and how that can also be sort of can be represented through something. I had a friend of mine ask me like, why China? And I was like, this is a woman's dowry. When you got married in the last century, not so much now, you got a whole place setting of China, and that was a lot of money. It might not be money now, but at that point in time was a lot of money. It also indicated the class that you came from, the ability to have these porcelain goods. At the beginning was only by royalty. And so as time goes by and it becomes more popularized, it's a common good for the average person. But at the very beginning, it meant wealth and mobility and accessibility.
Thank you, Juana. I want to move to share some images by Lilian Garcia-Roig, Banyan as Metaphor. We have two different types of work in the exhibition, which we'll have some slides of the work that is in the exhibition that you'll all get to see very soon. But I thought this was an interesting place to start because I think when a lot of people, I know when I think of your practice, I think of the large scale and the fragmentation of these different panels. So can you tell us a little bit about this work?
Yeah, so this is a piece that it's called Fluid Perceptions, Banyan as Metaphor. And as Amy mentioned, I've been living in Tallahassee for 21 years. So although I'm in Florida, I'm in northern Florida. So we do not have tropical trees. So in 2015, I was invited to be in a group show at the Ringling Museum. And they had banyan trees there on their property. And I've always wanted to paint them. And in part because, yes, they're interesting images, but in a lot of Caribbean islands, banyans are very common, and it's interesting that they're not native to the Caribbean, right? They're from South Asia, so that although they migrated to the Caribbean, we think of them as something of the Caribbean. And then the other aspect that was fascinating is that, you know, the way that their aerial roots grow. And so the roots become the trunks, and I thought this was kind of a beautiful idea of a type of migration, a type of spreading out, and one thing becoming another, right? Grounding itself in a new place and becoming the trunk. So what I do is I paint on site. I am a plein air painter. And so this is obviously you're thinking, how can I paint on site when it's this big? Well, my truck fits 4 by 5 foot canvases, so everything is 4 feet by 4 feet or 4 feet by 5 feet. And what I like to do is I paint all day for multiple days. In this case, I actually had sort of shortened days because I didn't have that much time on this property. So what I do is I don't paint like one big conglomerate. I love the idea of discovering. So when I paint during the course of the day, although I know what I'm looking at, I never know what the painting's going to look like. But I also don't know when it's done, but I know when it's not done, right? Because it doesn't look like what I'm experiencing. So, you know, going back to the course of the day, what does something look like if you're looking at it over the course of the day? And the answer is, I don't know, but I know when it doesn't look like that. So what I do when I think of trying to make large works is I will just make a lot of pieces from the same place, more than I need. These were 15 pieces. I made over 25 pieces. And then what I do is I bring them back, and on this I had to get on a ladder, and I start moving them around to find new connections. So the new connections are important because this also to me talks about how when people migrate or move, you know, you're an individual, right? My paintings are done individually. But then when you go to a new place, you might find a new interesting space between the spaces that didn't exist before those two things that weren't painted at the same site were made. But now by bringing them together, they actually create new spaces. So I think going back to this idea of the kind of anti-migration and, through migration, new things are made, right? And so this is a good thing. And so I like to continue to discover these mostly formal relationships by the act of moving individual pieces around. And in this case, I knew that I wanted to out Rubens in terms of the scale of what they had at the Ringling, right? I saw how big they were, and I wanted to make it a little bit bigger. So I do believe more can be more. But there you go.
Yeah. I think an interesting through line for all of you is the notion of place. And sometimes that place is very specific, and other times it's more generalized as this, idea that you're questioning and investigating. Emilio, I was just thinking of Lilian talking about the banyan tree. I know that we've talked about how the local, our Miami vegetation has inspired you as a child.
Absolutely, and actually banyan trees in particular, and I think what I love about these trees, and to me, every single one is fascinating because they're so unique. Each one has its own personality. Right. And I think that, it's funny, myself being back here in Miami, and I haven't done any sort of art projects here in quite some time, it's really brought back a lot of memories. And I've been thinking a lot lately about, sort of those early beginnings and the things that, made me an artist in the first place and what made me interested in making work, but also the type of work that I was doing. And growing up, sort of in Coconut Grove and South Miami and the Gables, where you have tons of trees like this, that was the imagery that was always kind of in front of me. And, interestingly enough, it's found its way into my work in a lot of different ways. More so now, I think, than ever with my latest paintings.
Thanks. Thank you. This work is published in the catalog that in companion to the exhibition, but it is not in the exhibition. However, I think it's really important to your practice, Lily, and I know we've had a lot of conversations about this piece. I know in sharing with a lot of people in our community about this exhibition, the Magotes came up quite a bit. And so, Lillian, can you tell us a little bit about the history of this piece?
Yes. So going back to working on site, I left Cuba when I was very young. I was 3, and I came to this country when I was 5. So I grew up in Texas, learned to speak English in San Antonio and all that good stuff. Houston, grew up in Houston. So I've never lived around a bunch of Cubans, just haven't. But I also can't go back to Cuba very easily, as many of us kind of know. So finally, I was able to go back in 1999. I was invited by the Ludwig Foundation to be a visiting artist there. And I was shocked at the connection I actually felt going to a place I had no firsthand memory of.
Okay.
Now, unfortunately, this was 1999, so in 2000, you all know an election happened and it made it so it was very difficult for people who didn't have immediate family to go to Cuba. So I wasn't able to return until later. But a big goal of mine was always to return to Cuba and paint in Cuba, because as a on-site landscape painter, I go across the country to essentially connect to places. And I often paint places, my husband says, I paint places that no one else would pay attention to. And I say, that's right. I don't go to the view, right? I go to the place that no one seems to care about, and then I spend all day looking at it, and I feel as though I have now made a connection to this place, even if it's temporary. I feel connected to it. And I think, I don't know if you all feel this way, but when people ask me where I'm from, I always respond, do you mean where I was born, where I grew up, or where I live now? Right? And none of those places are actually quite home. And so this yearning, right, that I think a lot of Cubans, especially those that left early, have. So this piece, I was finally able, actually through Nercy and Ramon, they were able to help me make connections to go back and paint in Cuba. And so I had studied all the landscape painters of Cuba that I could identify specific areas that they painted. And of course, Pinar del Rio, Juana's home, is like the best, and the one that I could go, I know exactly where, like Domingo Ramos painted that image. So I literally wanted to walk in the footsteps of the great Cuban artist. So I did a few on-site paintings, and Amy included one of the on-site paintings that I call Hecho en Cuba. But this one, so that's it. That one was one painted on site, and this is las dos hermanas mogotes around Pinar del Rio. So with this one, though, when I came back from Cuba, I was at the Joan Mitchell Center doing the residency there, and I wanted to really work in the studio, not just go outside and do my on-site painting like I normally do. So I wanted to see if I could, if as an on-site painter, I could still do work about a place that I was no longer at. And the only way to do that, moving from a perceptually based practice, was to move into a conceptually based practice where I actually took the Cuban pigment, soil, and I used that to create the image of the Cuban landscape. So hence, you know, I felt like as I'm still an on-site painter, I'm using the site to create an image of the place, even though I made it in the studio. So this was made out of dirt from Pinar del Rio. And it is the most, I think, iconic view of Pinar del Rio from Los Jazmines hotel, right? It's that view from there. So, and then this led to other, I still have a little bit of dirt left, so I'm still making some, and these are called the Hecho con Cuba series.
This is the work that's in the exhibition, and it's sandwiched by a 19th century painting by Valentin Sanscata and Miguel Arias. And, you know, I feel that this is, you know, it's meant to be, Lilian, that you're in this exhibition to see this kind of historical framework, not only with this work, that was so generously lent by the Cernudas, but also with your most recent work. So Lilian recently received a Guggenheim Fellowship, and we're very proud to, And we're very proud with this exhibition to just debut the very beginnings of this process, this research process. So I do have a detail and then a work for image from your studio of the new work, which is a departure from the paintings. Yes.
So the project, what happened is during the pandemic, I mean, I knew a little bit about my history. I knew over time that my great-great-uncle, Juan Tomás Roig, was a famous botanist in Cuba who wrote actually the books that are still used, the full endemic botanical, I guess, dictionary of Cuban plants Medicinal and Poisonous Plants of Cuba, Hard Timbers of Cuba, Cacti of Cuba. Who knew there were that many cacti? And he co-wrote a flora book as well. So these are still used in the university. And my first visit in 1999, I discovered it because I was in the old Havana, in the old book section. And I said, Juan Tomás Roig, I wonder if he's related to me. Because no one told me this, right? You know, you leave Cuba, you leave a lot. I mean, I really had no idea. And so I bought those books, but they were very dry books. They're very scientific books. There's no like drawings. And as an artist, of course, I wanted drawings. So on another trip, I started connecting with, there's a place called the Juan Tomás Roig Experimental Station to do a little bit more research, but they didn't have any visuals on them. So I kind of put that aside. I thought, okay, no visual information. So the pandemic came. And I couldn't go out and do my work. So I started doing more deep research. And I had actually been speaking with some people at the Smithsonian, some botanists over there, about trying to figure out which of these plants that were named after him were actually still named after him. It turns out that between the New York Botanical Gardens, Harvard, and the Smithsonian, there are over 1,000 specimens that were in his private collection, that were given. He has a lot more in Cuba that aren't archived. But there was also over 30 plants that were named after him, over 50 plants discovered by him. So I decided, well, how do I take this vast archive and filter it to something that makes sense? So what I did for this piece is the image, the plant, the Justicia Roigi plant, is the plant that actually has the most overlays with different important things that happened from Spain to Cuba and then the US. So the Justicia Roigi plant was one of the plants that you can find botanical illustrations from the first from the Ceci and the Mopox expedition of the very late 1700s. They actually had, there's 3 individual images from that expedition that I included. I also included plants that Juan Tomás Roig himself collected, as well as were named after him. So this idea of recollecting Roig, and collecting like a personal history, tracing a history. In my case, taking these plants that have my family name and using them. And then I also have a contemporary image of the plant. And then I included a couple of images of the most closely related plants that were in Florida. So the most closely related plant in where I live. So that's what this is. This is a Frankensteining of each of the Roig collected specimens, as well as parts of the Ceci and the Mopox expedition. And so what I did is I actually have some Cuban dirt. It's a little hard to see on there, but there's one. I finished painting one of the things with Cuban dirt, and I made a timeline. This timeline starts from 1500 to 2000. And so there's little marks that you'll see that relate to specific periods in not just Cuban history, but like you actually don't see the American Revolution on this one, but it's there. And then the Haitian Revolution, and when Cuba became independent, and then when the Cuban Revolution. The purple line is when we left. Anything blue is when the U.S. So another interesting thing I found out about Juan Tomás Roig is that in 1902 he was one of the folks that went to Harvard. A lot of Cubans kind of went to Harvard to then go back and teach. So he has an interesting intersection with the New York Botanical Gardens and those expeditions. And then so the little tag on the bottom, if you get to read that, it'll give you the information of all the different plants and all the different time periods of the different times of discovery that go from, I think, 1787 to 2022. So unlike, Juana's broader, data of Cuban migrations, this is a very specific collection of a Cuban that came from Mallorca. The first Roig came from Mallorca in 1787. And the first Roig was born in Cuba in 1804, which is a very important date. So they really overlay the whole kind of history of the Roig name, really overlays with the really kind of core of the creation of kind of Cuban history. So all this was new to me.
Thank you, Lilian.
Yeah.
I want to shift now to Emilio's work. This work is featured in the exhibition. It's also the back cover of the catalog. The catalog juxtaposes Esteban Chartrand and Emilio's work. The title of this work, I feel like could have been a subtitle of the exhibition. Emilio, could you tell us a little bit about this work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly serendipitous with the title, and what I can say about this work and this type of work that I'm now doing is that the type of work that I was doing for 20 years is actually quite different, but at the same time quite connected. And that earlier work really, for me, everything that I do is always very sort of personal, and that work for me was really always about intuition and being in the moment. And I think that there was always this sort of this organic quality to the work, although it looks quite different. Interestingly enough, the site-specific piece that I made here actually refers much more to my older work. And now I've sort of gotten to this point where I wanted to start, I guess, making the kind of paintings that I've been thinking about for a long time, the kind of paintings that have always sort of inspired me, and also using more sort of traditional materials. So I started painting in oils really just recently, and when I started making these things, it was just shortly after being in Cuba in 2019 that I'd been asked to participate in the biennial, and it was, I mean, for lack of a better word, a disaster for many reasons. But there was the project just didn't go the way it was planned. Of course, there wasn't the kind of sort of support for doing anything there, and I had like this moment where I was incredibly frustrated. All of my materials had been sort of stuck in customs, and what was supposed to be a 3-week project was condensed into one. So I had 2 weeks to myself really sort of thinking about this stuff, and sort of put myself in a situation that was much more like the people who are living that experience today. And of course, not that I didn't know that existed, but it really sort of hit me in a very hard way. And I was thinking a lot about my own personal history, my family's history, and I started wondering, like, well, why is it that I've always been attracted to this type of landscape? There's something about the Caribbean and Central America that's always sort of really pulled me, and I think a lot of it does have to do with growing up here, the type of sort of like the flora and fauna that has been sort of like the foundation of my work. And the one theme that I realized was that in all of these places that are these sort of idealized sort of visions of paradise, or at least mine, there's always a darkness that exists just underneath the surface, and you barely have to scratch that surface to find it. And as I started, thinking about these new works, I kind of had this idea of like sort of, using the darker side of paradise, I guess, as a departure point for the work. And the title, Melancolía Tropical, I don't typically title my works in Spanish. I mean, I do sometimes, and sometimes I don't. It kind of depends on what it is that I'm doing. I think stems a lot from the fact that growing up in as the son of Cuban immigrants, you're living, and in the United States, you're living these dual lives. You've got this Cuban life that you have at home, and then you have, your life outside of that, and they're quite different, or at least they were for me. And you're in a home that really, the whole idea of identity, nostalgia, is like basically like this weight that you're carrying all the time. And I started realizing how much this has really sort of affected me throughout my life. And I think what really sort of pushed me into becoming an artist was, I mean, I had, sort of the facility to make work, and I was interested in, I always had fun and I was creative. But in a way, I realized that it was almost it was a vehicle for me to sort of start to create my own identity, because I never really felt, like I was Cuban or American. I was sort of somewhere in the middle, or sort of, balancing on the hyphen that's in the middle. And so art really became the thing that allowed me to build an identity that could sort of encompass both of these things. And so it's just interesting that, this work, like really it's a brand new body of work, is being shown for the first time in Miami, not only here at the Frost Museum, but also at this upcoming show that I'm doing at Fred Snitzer. And it's really made me think a lot about those beginnings and what it was that I was looking for. And so much of it was about escape. And my escape growing up, in the Grove, was climbing trees, climbing banyan trees.
Yeah.
Everyone
Yeah.
was different. Everyone was a challenge. You're having a conversation with these, with these like natural sort of elements, and also spending a lot of time on the water. And that's always been sort of like a big love of mine in so many ways. So it's really a new departure for me, but a very exciting one, because I feel that this work, unlike the previous work, is really sort of much more about self-reflection as opposed to the work that I was doing previously, which was much more about being in the moment.
Thank you, Emilio. I wanted to share some other new work by Emilio. It's not included in the exhibition, but to give you a preview of his forthcoming exhibition that he mentioned at the Schnitzer Gallery. I remember the first time I went to your studio, and I think there is a lot of art historical references. And I remember asking you about U.S. painters like Marston Hartley and Arthur W. You were like, not necessarily. Being the curator on the outside, of course, right, is always dangerous. But I know you've talked about automatism and taking this sort of notion from surrealism. You've also Italian Renaissance paintings being a source of inspiration. I wondered if you could walk us through some of those historical references in the work.
Well, so you're right. This is a new painting, and just to give you a point of reference, this painting is 84 by 72, so 7 by 6 feet. So it has a presence, and you have a physical relationship to it.
I have an image of it.
Well,
there you go.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, so that's the inside of my studio as of last week, which is so. So that work, I mean, first of all, I've always tried to make the paintings that I'd like to look at, which are the ones that inspire the viewer's imagination and give the viewer sort of a place to go, and which is why I've always been so attracted to landscape paintings, whether it be like, the Hudson River School or, landscapes of the Northern Renaissance, where you could like really just get into a painting and spend a lot of time there and have that painting. The more time you spend looking at it, the more it gives you. And, interestingly enough, we had met, I think, prior to me making this painting, but I'd spent some time. Oftentimes we go to Puerto Rico in the winter, and we were up in the mountains, and I'd been thinking so much about this exhibition in collaboration with you guys, and also the other work, the historical work that was in the show. And we were up in the mountains in Utuado, which sadly got really damaged by this past hurricane. But I was thinking really about the site-specific piece that we were going to make here, and I was thinking about this tall vertical, and I had this kind of vision in my head of what it was going to look like. And I happened to stumble upon a vista that was exactly what I had in mind. In the end, it became this painting and not what's here at the gallery. but again, it was that sort of connecting to the landscape. And even though it's not sort of a literal depiction of the landscape, I think that the landscape is this amazing sort of vehicle to do a lot of different things. And recently, I was talking with a friend who does paint a lot in nature and outdoors, and he was talking about the landscape, and he said something so beautiful, that it's not just about what it is that you're seeing when you're painting the landscape, but it's what you're feeling. It's how the sun feels on your skin. It's the wind that sort of blows at the back of your neck, and all of those things influence the work in one way or another. In my case, I'm not trying for the literal representation of these places, but almost just the feeling. And of course, there is that mystery, there is that darkness, and you never know, what you're going to find, like, underneath, behind a bush, or, when you're climbing a banyan tree and you stick your hand in a hole and there could be, something, I don't know.
Right.
So it's that sort of thing. And for me, it's just, the new direction for me is just quite exciting, because it gives me a whole new host of material that I can sort of mine to create work.
Right. And would you say your painting practice and this connection to nature is meditative? And are there certain rituals for you in terms of connecting to nature?
Well, I mean, I think that, the ocean has always been like sort of my, sort of my holy place. And I think that what I love about it, part of it actually was growing up on the water, and just to connect it back to Cuba, is that growing up in a Cuban home, never knowing this place, but hearing all of the stories and sort of like, and feeling all of this nostalgia. Um, every time that I was in the ocean, I always thought about this place that was just on the other side of the horizon.
Mm.
And it was inescapable every single time from as long as I can remember. And so that, the ocean was a place that always sort of called me. So I can't say that there's, a ritual necessarily, but I think that most recently, I would say in the last few years, I think I've just been doing a lot more sort of self-reflection, a lot more, thinking about, the reasons why I make the decisions that I do. And with that, have come dreams. I've been meditating a lot more, and I think that really, or these things are all influences in this work, which is a much slower process than my previous work. An oil painting really has something. You have to sort of spend time with it. You have to look at it. You have to contemplate. You can't, or at least I can't, just paint it. So I think the ritual is really that. It's about slowing down and taking the time to really sort of feel the space that you're working in.
Thank you. For me, this exhibition is so much about memory and our connections to place. And we all have different memories of the same place. And we certainly have different memories of myriad places. And since we are talking today about Cuba, and Amelia mentioned earlier bringing it back to Cuba, I wonder if you could think about, for you, either in your work or personally, when you think about this relationship between Cuba and memory, what surfaces?
Well, I guess it's kind of what I said previously, that I think that for me, I didn't live the Cuban experience. I lived it sort of vicariously through others and through the memories of others. So really, it wasn't until I went to Cuba for the first time in 2001 that I started to sort of put things together. And, I just realized that, it's such a huge part of who I am. And like I said, it's, I've been asked, so many times I've been asked about, whether or not, what is it about being Cuban that's influenced your work? And I've always said, well, nothing really. And I was interviewed, I did a site-specific video installation that was commissioned by the Kennedy Center. I think it was in 2017, and it was for the Cuba. They were doing a Cuba festival, so they do a country every 2 years. They do a big festival, and this was the first time that they were going to include Cuban artists, and they wanted to include or visual artists rather, and they wanted to also include both Cuban artists and Cuban American artists, and I was one of the Cuban American artists. And so I was asked this question, and it was really it was that moment that I had that sort of that light bulb moment that I was like, wait a second, it isn't Cuba that sort of influences my work. It's the fact that I've lived this experience and lived in this space where I didn't have like sort of like a full identity, or at least I didn't feel that way. And this is like when I was in my formative years of becoming an artist, when I was I don't know, I must have been like 15 or 16. There must have been some sort of like subconscious identity struggle, and I think that was what that's what sort of pushed me to being an artist, like I was saying before, because that was something that I was able to use to build my own identity that could encompass all of these things. And so I was quite fortunate in the sense that from a very early age, I knew that no matter what, in one way or another, I was going to be an artist, and that decision was made, and I just stuck to it. Because why? Because of course, like if I didn't stick to it, then I would lose my identity. So, so that was kind of that was the impetus for really sort of pushing and trying to make it work. And so far, I'm here. So
It's stuck.
Juana or Lilian, do you want to add to that idea?
Wait, I have to look this up because I want to make sure that I get it properly stated. Yeah, no, because actually I'm in an exhibition. No, I have work in an exhibition curated at Harvard by Alejandro de la Fuente, and actually let me read in Barbaro. I'm trying to find their names here. Created by Alejandro de la Fuente, at the director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute, Barbara Martinez Ruiz, and Carrie A. Garcia-Roig. And so it was I'm thinking in terms overall, the piece they selected, and it's interesting the way you selected this particular work. It's interesting Alejandro selected that particular work, and the work in that show is called La Chancleta de Cecilia Valdés, and internally I call it my inheritance, La Chancleta de Cecilia Valdés. And to understand the work is also to understand the Cuban identity, the mixed mulata Cuban identity, right? And so for me, which I have the name Valdez, and that story that comes with the name Valdez, and I was with my office at UMass, and a student came in and like, oh, tell me something about yourself, and I'm like, okay, well, my last name is Valdez, and then I told them, well, the name Valdez is actually more Portuguese, is not with the Z, it's with an S, but in Cuba, it has this particular story. There was an orphanage, and kids were left in the orphanage, and it was believed that these were of of illicit sort of conceptions, and so all the kids that come out of that orphanage get the last name Valdez, and there's a good possibility that actually my father's father came out of that orphanage, and my name may not even be Valdez, but this is an inheritance. This is that conflict, that identity that comes out of Cuba in the sense of place also as well, and it is all tied together. And when I was making the work, I was thinking about the coincidence by Sergio Villaverde when he writes the book, and actually, he is published in Cuba, but I think it's finalized and released in New York, and about the remake that Arenas also made, Ronaldo Arena makes, and his also beginning his sort of writing experience in Cuba in the birth of the revolution, and then eventually also ends up in exile, and that whole experience is reverberated in my own experience, and it's tied to the history, it's tied to the identity of Cuba, and it reconstructs that kind of lineage and that historical component that makes up who I am in a personal matter, but also makes up the history of Cuba too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess I want to add that in the early 90s, I remember reading Gustav Fermat's Life on the Hyphen. And that was really a pretty important book for me, because this idea of, are you on the hyphen? You're not American enough, you're not Cuban enough. And so this idea of that in between, and then, where do you fit? Maybe you don't fit, maybe you have to create your own, but also this idea of hyphenation, and I would call maximalism. I used to call it conjunctivism. Like, people would always say, you need to choose. And my gut response was always, why? Why, if I like this and I like that, why can't I have this and that? Why can't I put those things together? And I think this is something that I really discovered very clearly in many ways through the Relational Undercurrent show, that I think this aesthetic of putting things that shouldn't be together, right, and making new things is a very common thread. Amongst, I think, folks who have all these kind of mixed and different kind of experiences and backgrounds, and that's kind of Cuban, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think it's not even just unique to Cuba either.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like it's unique to so many other sort of immigrant stories, or people that have been displaced in one way or another. But this is the one that sort of involves us in particular.
But I think we embraced it a lot. In the 80s, I used to fight a lot against, it was minimalism, right? It was like, why do you want to, do more, put everything in the kitchen sink in? And so this was the education that it was in the 80s and the 90s, right? And so now you see this language of that's about that now, but it wasn't around back then. So it's exciting to see that, and to see things. It's okay to be complicated. And messy. That's actually good.
Well, it's also about not what were you saying about not knowing when you're done?
Yeah.
You know when you're not done.
You know when you're not done.
Right.
I think this idea of it's okay to be messy and it's okay for things to be complicated is another impetus of the exhibition. When I was in graduate school, I read a book called Inside the American Home. Maybe some of you have read it. And graduate students went to different homes in Manhattan, and they took inventories of what people had in their homes, what type of art was present. And overwhelmingly, people had landscapes. Coupled with my reading of W.J.T. Mitchell's book, Landscape and Power, I began to think about how landscapes are much more than just pretty pictures. They're containers of meaning, and they tell us a lot about history. Sometimes history that we don't want to discuss, and sometimes history that we are very very almost painfully familiar with. And I hope that in hearing from our three artists today, you can have a glimpse of some of the powerful undercurrents in their practices, and that you'll also see that come together in the exhibition. I have been told by my wonderful colleagues that we have time for 2 questions.
We have to make a really complex question.
Go ahead and get the mic. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from our audience?
Oh, we were so thorough. Ah, there we go.
Thank you so much to the panelists for joining us today here at FIU, the Frost Museum, of course. So you guys discussed a lot of different themes that have to do with culture, Latin America, and history. Sometimes people exit a museum and they'll see a lot of different gifts, or nowadays that everybody is a photographer with their phone. They'll take a photo and will be able to share artwork with everybody else. What do you think, or what would you say about sharing artwork and the people who like to criticize sometimes commercialization of artwork? Do you think that it is positive, negative, sharing artwork with others, and the kind of open source that has to do with sharing artwork to reach more people, to be able to spread a different message, or at least spark a lot of curiosity? So at least for me, I really enjoyed this panel here today. And sometimes people criticize that, when they see that in a museum, but at least for me, it's really inspiring. So I wanted to know, what do you think as emerging artists about this theme and this kind of criticism that occurs today? Thank you again.
I think if we were talking about like social media and all these other things, I think it's a double-edged sword. I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot is that, for example, if I sell a painting to a museum and it's in the permanent collection, chances are that painting is going to be exhibited for whatever, 4 months, 6 months, however long it is. So a number of people will see it, but then after that, it's going to go into storage and it may not be seen for who knows, 10, 20 years. So there's something to be said about being able to share an image, or even having a work in a public place. That said, I think that sometimes, it becomes oversaturated, and, things sort of get lost in the ether. So, like, I don't know, it goes both ways, I suppose.
Any other questions? Anyone else from our audience want to ask a question to any of the artists? Well, I want to thank all of you for coming today. I hope Emilio won't kill me for showing this image that I took with my cell phone.
It looks pretty good.
Well, I mean, I would say just go see it, and it's right upstairs. So
But as Emilio says, this site-specific mural is now in the galleries, and it's quite something to behold, and looks very different than it does on this PowerPoint. I know we're going to have time in a little bit for remarks. I don't want to miss the opportunity to thank some of the graduate students at FIU who helped with this project, who I see in the audience: former graduate student Araceli Vasquez-Diaz, Alexandra Gelbard, and Rosemary Palenzuela Vicente. This project would not be what it is without their contributions. And so on that note, thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.